Hello and welcome to the Open Era podcast. My name is Devang and Simon. Simon and I are off this week, but we thought we'd look back at the remarkable Iga Swiatek, who continues to set new marks in 2024, coming off of her victory at Indian Wells. We look back at Iga during her ascent in tennis a few years back, and it's funny to think that it wasn't too long ago that we were asking what's next for Miss Swiatek, and she just continues to amaze us. So enjoy this deep dive into Iga Swiatek. Simon and I really enjoyed doing this episode. We really enjoyed covering this player, frankly, and she's been a breath of fresh air, so hope you enjoy it as much as we did.
Hello and welcome to the Open Era podcast. My name is Devang and Simon. I'm joined, as always, by Mr. Simon Bushell, well into the look back territory for 2022, the holiday season. Bush tying a bow on a pretty exceptional year in tennis, both on and off the court. Do we dive right in, or do we talk about the beautiful scenes in Paris and your trip to Roland Garros to see a scene of someone we're about to talk about having some great success?
Yeah, it's interesting that you said an extraordinary year on and off the court. I think more good than bad in a lot of ways. No, wait, that's probably unfair. More bad than good. Let's not give tennis that much credit. But in a lot of ways, the best part about it was the exploits of one Iga Swiatek, and we did promise during our year-end awards show that we would go back and give her her due, and that's where we end up today with a look back at one of the most spectacular years in modern tennis, and arguably the best year in women's tennis since Serena Williams back in 2000, in the early 2000s. So yeah, we will go blow by blow to account to what happened in Swiatek's season. And I think that really begins, and we can begin, with what happened at the French Open in 2020 when she stormed onto the scene as a young teenager and a phenom to lap the field and win her first Grand Slam, Dev.
She did, and I will admit, part of me did think that maybe this was one of those French Open winners, Bush, and I use that term derisively because we've seen some people win this tournament and maybe not go away, but they fade away from the top and they're heard from again, but not to the same level. And Iga coming into that tournament 54th in the world and beating the people she did, including Vondrousova, including Sofia Kenin, who basically became the person I just talked about in terms of fading away after shining so brightly. Iga Swiatek just arrived, and she arrived in such an exceptional way that part of me was skeptical that this could be continued or this could be the start of something pretty prolific.
Yeah, which I think is an interesting question to analyze where we were both on her after she won that French Open, because you saying that there's the potential for her to go in one of two directions, whether or not she was able to fulfill that talent and go on and achieve great success in her career, or whether she was going to fade into obscurity like we have seen with many first-time Grand Slam winners, especially on the WTA side, where it's been a cycle of first-time winners who have then sort of disappeared. And I think that's what made her 2021 season so fascinating before we get into what happened in the course of this year, because she wasn't able to defend that title in 2021 at Roland Garros. Admittedly, she made the quarterfinals. And across the board, you have to say, despite everything else that happened, she had a pretty damn good season in 2021. She ended the year world number 4, and she made the 4th round or better at every single Grand Slam. I think she was the only woman on tour that was able to do that. So the questions were asked at the back end of that season of what is the future for this player? She was still 20 years old, and was she able to put it together on all surfaces, or whether she was just a one slam wonder on that one surface on clay where she still looked pretty damn impressive.
Yeah, and I think 2021, maybe it didn't bring the trappings of a surefire star. Like, she didn't win a couple slams after 2020, right, Bush? Like, there was some trials and errors and her finding her way, but the consistency, I think, was a really great sign. And the fact that she was only I think she was the only player to have reached the second week of all slams that year as well, is a pretty good indicator of someone who is pretty exceptional on all surfaces, but maybe not too adept on the hard courts just yet. Because I think after seeing her excel at the French Open, there was questions about transferring this ability to the other surfaces. And even though the grass court season is incredibly short, didn't look like she was having such a great time out there, Bush. So, and we wondered, okay, so maybe not Wimbledon, but the hard courts. And even on the hard courts themselves, she wasn't as imposing as she could be. And I think the main reason why is she had all the offensive shots. She could hit the piss out of the ball, as we like to say. But defensively, I think there was a lot of work to be done for Iga. And 2021 kind of displayed that, because she was good, and she was good to make the second week at all these slams, but there was limitations to her game.
I agree, absolutely. I think defensively it was one of the weaknesses that was still in her game. And I think she's become such an exceptional mover. And I think it's one of the first things you probably think about her now is that she is so good laterally. I don't think that was still the case, despite winning that Grand Slam in 2020 and bursting on the scene. I think she did that in a way which was more power and more nous and taking a lot of people by storm. And we've seen a lot of players who have won those first Grand Slams is there's not a lot of tape on them. People have not worked out their patterns and have not worked out what they go to specifically. And she kind of fell a little bit into that trap in 2021, but I think it's testament to how big her weapons are in her game that she was able to overcome them and still be a very, very good player and to continue that growth in the way that she did.
Well, I just... Bush, consider where she was at the end of 2021. Like, she makes the WTA finals, but that tournament ends pretty badly, right? Like, she's basically walking off the court in tears after a long season and ninth in the world, but also maybe more questions than answers at that point. Like, it was a pretty big turning point, I felt like.
I think that's true, yeah. She was very high profile in her conversations about her own mental health following that tournament. As you say, tears at the net following a drubbing by Maria Sakkari, which is some foreshadowing of what happens in 2022, because that is not an even rivalry as we sit here today. It's kind of funny looking at that match back just to see how she capitulates in it. And we understand now where she was, like what she was dealing with at that time and how outspoken she has been in general. But it's kind of fascinating to look back at the questions that were asked at the back end of 2021 to go into 2022. I think some people could say that they were going to see a good season for her. But I think if you were going to say that we were going to see this season, you were definitely lying.
No, who could have predicted this? And I think that we cannot really talk about Iga Swiatek in 2022 without acknowledging the seismic news that was Ash Barty leaving the game. Because I'll say this, Iga still has an amazing year, and she's still her, and she still put together an incredible win streak. But there is still a large part of me that really wishes we got to see Barty versus Iga the whole year, because I think Barty kind of stepping off the stage only for Iga to take her place was fitting, but it also left me a bit hollow.
Totally, yeah. And I think that's actually a really good starting point for our discussions of 2022 and her season in general, because that last match that we saw between the two of them in Adelaide, the Adelaide Open at the start of the season in January, was the last meeting between these two. And we were kind of robbed of what I think was going to be an exceptional rivalry for a very, very long time. And you look back at that, and it's hard to imagine that this would be the last meeting of these two. And I know you're on record as saying that
it won't be. It won't be, Simon. It won't be.
And I appreciate that. But for the time being, as we're recording this podcast and sitting here as we are, it is the last meeting between the two of them. And Barty dominates. It's not actually that close. And I wonder how differently this season goes if Ashley Barty is still playing on the tour, whether or not any of these runs that we saw from Swiatek would be ended by a player as dominant in her own way as Ashley Barty was. But I think it's kind of interesting that the two are intertwined in the way they are, because yes, Barty, after the Adelaide final, just a few months later, has retired from the game. But the trajectory is remarkable, because obviously Barty goes on to win that Australian Open. Swiatek herself loses to Danielle Collins in the semi-final in a match. I mean, we can watch back the highlights now, and there's no way that Iga Swiatek should lose that match, knowing what we know, what comes next. And hindsight is easy, but fair play to Danielle Collins, the way that she played in that match. But Swiatek really probably wanted that one back.
Yeah, and I mean, that was it. That was the chance to get this blockbuster, at least in 2022. And watching Ash Barty just destroy people in that tournament, but would have been nice to see maybe someone give her a go. And I think Danielle Collins did in that final, at least in the second set. But we were robbed of that, and I found almost a way of Iga learning. Ash Barty retired, and it was recounted in a great wrap-up piece by Tumaini Carriol at The Guardian regarding Iga's season. But the way she learned of Barty's retirement, basically with her team coming to her door at her hotel in Miami and being like, "Hey, Ash Barty's just retired. You're the face of women's tennis right now." And Carriol mentions the ability to go one of two ways with that, right? And it goes back to what we talked about at the 2020 French Open. It's like, okay, you've done this. Cool. What next? And okay, Ash Barty's retired. Cool. What next? And what next is probably one of the greatest seasons we've seen in this sport, which once again is a testament to how strong this person is mentally.
I think there were signs of it through 2021, going into even that first part of 2022, of just her consistency as well. I don't think any other woman on the tour besides the aforementioned Ashley Barty was as consistent as her on all four surfaces. And I think that's testament to the fact that her getting to the semi-final and her getting to the second week, it was a sixth straight Grand Slam making the second week in a row, which you're not able to do that, especially in the women's game, which is a bit more topsy-turvy and there's not the same balance at the top end of the sport. To be able to do that shows a player of immense promise and immense talent. And I think what comes after that is just like ridiculous. It's a fulfillment of all the talent that she had and a fulfillment of this kind of built up energy, which has been threatening to burst forward. And I think that was very much on display at the Qatar Open, where she absolutely annihilated Maria Sakkari and Annette Kontaveit in the final. And if you go back and watch the highlights of that tournament, this is her in full confidence and in full flight. And to do that just a couple of weeks removed from the Australian Open in a loss in a semi-final that she should have won, I think is testament to how good of a player she is.
It's the beginning of a whole lot of Polish flags on the WTA Tour 2022 calendar. Really impressive. And I think you get the news, and you mentioned the Sakkari demolition. She does it in Indian Wells to win that tournament. She's number 2 in the world. She gets the news about Ash Barty. How do you follow that up? Like, how do you secure number 1? You go and just destroy Naomi Osaka in the final as well, which I don't know how much you can read into that now, knowing what we know about Naomi's season and where she was at. But once again, laying down a marker about what your intent is really impressive then. And what I think I kept asking and laying the most unfair expectations at the feet of Iga Swiatek was, how do you become a household name in tennis when you're from a country that's maybe not normally associated with tennis stars, when you're from a place that doesn't get the same media attention as if she would have been from the UK or the United States? How do you capture the attention of the wider masses if you're Iga Swiatek, if you're put into this situation where you're the women's number 1, but maybe not enough people know who you are, even though you're a slam winner? And I think the way she did that, Bush, throughout the rest of the season was pretty remarkable, because it's someone literally telling the world, this is who I am this damn good, and you better pay attention. And whether you like it or not, whether or not you think I check all the boxes when it comes to being a tennis star, quote unquote, I'm here and I'm that.
And I think we need to reevaluate what it means to be a tennis star in 2022 as well, because it isn't just all about marketing. I think it's about having an excellent head on your shoulders and to be relatable to a lot of people as well. And I think she has that in abundance. Not only is her game spectacular and she's just really fun to watch, obviously she's a tremendous mover and has obviously the best forehand in maybe all of tennis. It's certainly on the WTA side.
I think so.
But the secondary part to that is she's just a very likable person as well. Like, her views on the world, she seems very level-headed. She's very transparent in the way that she talks about her own mental health and what she's struggling with, and her views on the world as well in general. To come from a country like that and to have, as we've seen through the course of this year, some troubles, as they say in Britain, to gloss over some more horrible things that have happened in her home country of Poland, to be as brave as she is in speaking forward about that. Mm-hmm. I think she's a model for a lot of athletes to follow for what makes a superstar in 2022.
Just a note, this has nothing to do with her her tennis season or her tennis exploits, but I do love the fact that her dad was an athlete, Aurora Thomas, who I believe is like the tournament director of the Poland Open on the WTA tour, and her mom was an orthodontist. I do love that Iga obviously goes into athletics, but her sister is a dentist. I like how basically they're like, okay, we keep this one side is the athletes, one side is the teeth people. Let's keep it separated.
I mean, that's how it worked in my family. Is that not how it worked in yours, brother?
I guess not really, but it's tremendous. And seeing her father in the role that he's played in her career as well, and kind of relying on that support. Like a lot of these players we've talked about, Simon, throughout the years, there is a commonality in the sense that I think they have fortunate and unfortunate in some cases. I mean, looking at you, Andre Agassi, where they have the total devotion, the total backing of the people closest to them. And they're willing to put a lot of things on the line to sacrifice for them. And it's helpful when you're trying to reach goals like this. It's not a one-person operation, even though that's what we see on the court. It takes a village, as they say.
It really does. And I think we say all these things over and over again. It's testament to the fact that the camp around her is solid and that she
normal. And honestly, Bush, though, we keep saying this, we're like, hey, the camp around you is nice, or they're normal. And these are the bar has been shifted so drastically low by the other goons applying their trade.
I think that's why the end of 2021 was kind of interesting as well, because obviously you have the coaching change and you have like some noise, I guess you could say, around a racket change as well to change brands. And I know it's not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things, but tennis players are very picky about these weird elements of their game. And to have that mild elements of instability, just given that she did win a Grand Slam and all those things were kind of settled, to then come out and do what she did in the course of the season, it is remarkable to see someone fulfill the talent the way that she has done. I should touch on the fact, just to add some meat onto this segment, that loss to Danielle Collins in the semi-final in Australia and then that win at Qatar, it began a streak. It began a streak which went to 35 matches, which of course we'll come on to in a second. But just to give some context and some flavor of where we are in the season, yeah, this is the start of a very, very formidable run where she beats some players and beats them to the point of submission where she's winning in straight sets and bageling people left, right, and center.
37 matches, by the way, Bush. Don't undercount.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it bears repeating. 37 matches in a row, 6 titles in a row between February and June, 8 titles overall. She ran up against her peers, some of her elders on the tour, and handled them both with disconcerting ease. With the backdrop of Serena walking away from the game or evolving away from the game as well, Simon, I think the conversation about what does Iga mean to the sport intensified, and I think it will intensify even more in 2023 as she really does become the focal point. And you'll see, unfortunately, though you alluded to it not being all about marketing, you'll see them attempt to try and market her, I think, to a larger level. But I thought this year was a large part about tennis. And I worry maybe that won't be the same going forward. So for that reason as well, I think we should cherish it.
I think that's a very important point to make. This season was purely and simply about tennis. Like, she just came out and absolutely fulfilled everything that she had in terms of her game. And I guess just to go chronologically to this before we step into part 2 is that, yes, the titles you mentioned, the big ones on that streak, wins Qatar, wins Indian Wells, wins Miami, and she's the first Polish woman ever to win those titles, and indeed to do the Sunshine Double as well. And of course, she becomes world number 1 during that period of time, following Ashley Barty's retirement. And I think that's an interesting point for us to break as well, because you're on the back of 3 massive titles. You're on the back of the world number 1 retiring and the entire weight of the tour being placed upon this young lady's shoulders. It's a pretty damn good encore, which comes next, is it not?
Quite good. We'll get into that, plus a lot more about Iga Swiatek coming up next on Open Era. Welcome back to the Open Era podcast. It's Iga Swiatek all the time on this week's show, wrapping up 2022 and talking about the biggest stories, the biggest people. We did our year-end awards, got some feedback. Bush, our golden rackets, currently being carved in the mountains of Zurich right now. So we'll get them delivered hopefully sometime next year. But the awards show, always a hit. But now we get into the biggest stories, the biggest people of 2022. And how could we not start with someone that we've been wanting to profile for a long time, Iga Swiatek, the 2022 season of all seasons, the season where she went on a 37-match winning streak, a season where she won 2 slams, a season where she was world number 1. But Simon, it begins like most of these streaks do, not in the limelight, not at the biggest tournaments, not at the slams per se. It's about building a base and starting this new road forward after taking over the number 1 ranking.
Indeed so. And if you were counting at this point, she was 28 straight set wins in a row in Stuttgart before she finally drops a set. What an absolute loser. Finally dropping a set. That Ludmila Samsonova, who herself had an excellent season in the semi-final. Yeah, you heard that correctly. 28 straight sets, won in a row. She goes on to win that tournament, obviously, beats Anya Sabalenka in the final. And that's one to go back and really check out if you're interested in seeing how dominant she was at this part of the season. The way that she absolutely tore Anya Sabalenka apart in that Stuttgart final is astonishing to watch.
Sabalenka is an interesting foil for Iga the whole year, I feel like, Bush. Like, she plays her a bunch. She plays her in New York. She plays her, I think, the next week after Stuttgart in Italy as well, right? Where she beats her again very handily. But, I mean, if you want to say you're a defensive player and say you are able to hang with some of the big sluggers on tour, I think Aryna Sabalenka is the perfect foe in that endeavor, Simon. Because boy, does she hit the ball quite hard, and she can match Iga, I think, on her ground strokes. But athleticism is one thing, defensive ability is another thing, and I think you could see Iga passing Sabalenka quite considerably throughout the course of the season in that regard.
Well, I think if you look at it on the surface, you would say that this is a mismatch. And I think that's what the amazing thing is about our sport and the sport of tennis, is that on the one side, you have a 5'6" beanpole thin, even though she's an incredible athlete in Iga Swiatek. And then you have the big towering 6-foot Belarusian who is supposed to hit the ball harder than anyone else. And it's Iga with the bigger forehand. It's Iga with the, some would say, better technique and ability to move around the court. That's the amazing thing about tennis, is that it doesn't matter how slight of a build you are. If your timing is exceptional and your footwork is phenomenal in the way that it is for the pole, you're going to be an incredible player. And yeah, she is an interesting foil for the rest of the season, as you mentioned. They do play again a couple of other times. And for the most part, this is a bit of a one-sided rivalry, but there's a few moments that we will come onto in part 3 that kind of break that a little bit. That being said, Dev, we're on the clay courts here, as we're talking in chronological order, and no one touches her on the clay courts all season.
Not at all. Not at all. And I mean, a return to normalcy in some sense of like, okay, the 2020 French Open was real, and this all happened, and it was all foreshadowing what was about to become the most dominant clay court outside of Rafael Nadal, probably. I think that's safe to say, Simon. She does it in Stuttgart, she does it in Italy, and then she arrives in Paris at the French Open looking to reassert her claim as the best at the biggest tournament on this surface. And I think the people she beat, the players she beat along the way, not going to say a true murderer's row till we get to Zheng, until we get to see maybe the first bit of, okay, she's human, this streak maybe does have a shelf life. Zheng really took a tour in that first set. It was the first time it really looked like Iga looked uncomfortable in a long while.
I agree. And I think just to set the scene a little bit as well, is that it's easy to sit here and talk in retrospective about how good of a season it is. And it's obvious that this streak happened. But I think for every week that went past, she solidified this idea that she was the dominant woman on tour and the person to beat. And each passing win that went by, you weren't particularly shocked by it. And I don't know that the narrative was ever like, this is a fluke or it's going to come to an end. It was so dominant, and it looked, for all intents and purposes, like she was just not going to lose for the rest of the season. Like, it was going to take something spectacular to knock her off her game. And I think that's why that match against Zheng was it was so interesting from a narrative standpoint because it was the first time in a long while that she actually looked human for a set, and not just for a set and a bit. Like, she was struggling for a little while and then obviously found her game, brought it all together, and then the rest is history, as we all say. But it's not easy, and it's really not, lest we sit here and forget that every single passing match that went by, there were questions that needed to be answered, and that she performed so well and her level was so damn high that even when someone took a set off her was the moment they were like, oh.
Shocking news.
Exactly.
So I honestly remember where I was when that happened, because I was getting text messages being, it's happening, it's over, she's done, she's finished. She bageled Zhang the next set, Simon. Bageled her. She bageled a lot of people this year. She nearly set a record for that, but this is impressive. And I mentioned the rankings and the people she had to beat along the way, because I think that might have been also a cudgel used against Iga's successes this year. And well, how good were these people really? But from Zhang forward in this tournament, she ends up playing the main protagonists on the tour this season, I think, Simon, and Pegula, Kastakita, and Coco Gauff. Those are 4 people, if I want to include Zhang as well, who were around and in the conversation at most times during the big moments on the WTA.
Yeah, I mean, you throw in someone like Ons Jabeur, and that's basically the tour, isn't it? That's the top end of the women's game that she had to get through. And you mentioned it's not really a murderer's row, and I think that's testament to just how good Iga Swiatek was this season, that she made the best of the best, who were top 5 players or top 10, look extremely average. Like, absolutely, not like scrubs. And I don't mean it to be disrespectful. I just mean in the sense that the level was so different between Swiatek and her opponents at this point that it looked like she was playing a different sport, and it looked like that she had every single answer that was posed to her. And I think she brought that aura to her in all of these matches at that point. And it's so important in this sport where the marginal gains are so small and you're looking for everything at every point, that if you can carry that aura with you and you can carry the idea that you are head and shoulders above the field, it does count for a lot. If you're saying that's already a game that you've won by the time you step on the court, then it goes a long way when you only have to win 12 of them.
Yeah, I think that aura probably led to beating Coco Gauff 20 minutes into that final at the French Open, Simon. I think that match was done. That match was done very quickly, and we got to get the stat trending. Aura per 60 or aura per 90. How much aura do you have? She was off the charts in aura at that point, and it led her to absolutely blitzing Coco off the court, and Coco obviously so feeling emotional about it, but Iga being the big sister, so to speak, and like, hey, you'll be back, you'll be fine. And it's true, she will be. But once again, morphing into this veteran on tour when you repeatedly have to check out how old she actually is and say, yeah, she's 21. This is abnormal. She's extremely level-headed, extremely even-keeled for someone her age, and in these big moments. And even when she's not, which is fine, again, these people are human beings. And especially against Zhang Bush, you could see it's like, what internally do you do when things go wrong when they haven't gone wrong in so long is one of those fascinating questions I have about people in sports. Like, what do they dig into, or what do they find inside themselves to get it right or get back on track? And obviously it's different for every different person, but you get a glimpse into watching Iga sit down between games, or sit down and figure it out on her own at most times, or gesturing to her box sometimes. But it's a really interesting glimpse into someone who has an ability, I think, to really compartmentalize and also respond to expectations in a pretty exceptional way.
Well, I love this idea, and maybe it's an episode in its own right that we could do, which is this idea that what is the light switch that gets flicked for all of these amazing players? You obviously have your Novak Djokovic never missing, your Serena Williams idea, okay, I'm just going to hit the ball harder and just go for broke and demolish you. The same with Rafael Nadal, is you're going to harness that energy and bring a wave towards you. Or in the case of, and I think this is probably the most obvious comparison, to someone like Roger Federer, who just looks himself in the mirror and goes, oh yeah, I'm Roger Federer. That's the light switch that usually flicks on to say, okay, now I'm going to go and win the second set. And that's kind of what happened with Iga throughout the year. It's not like her tactical changes were hugely, and it's not like her game was massively different. It's just like she decided to take it up a level, maybe a little more pace on the forehand and dictating play. But it's not like her A game, or it's not like she went away from her A game to try and find to navigate these victories. She just played better. Like, and I know it's redundant analysis, and I don't mean it to be that way, but when you're as good as she is, like sometimes just putting your head in a towel during a changeover and going, yeah, I'm just better than my opponent. I just need to play better, and that's kind of what happens with her.
She wins the French Open. The streak does end though at Wimbledon. Who else? Elise Cornet, the streak killer, the giant killer, right before the Poland Open as well. It had to end at some point, but it was fitting. It had to be Elise Cornet, Simon. And once again, grass. I still have questions about grass and Iga. It's just you don't get any time on it. How do you figure that out?
It's a good question, isn't it, to see what adjustments she makes in her game going forward to try and dominate on that surface the way that she has done on everything else. I will bring up this point, and I know I say it on this podcast a lot. She did win the junior championship at Wimbledon. Like it's not like she doesn't have pedigree on this surface. She is able to do this. She's a previous Grand Slam champion at that level, and her performances in doubles also suggest that she's able to play on that surface. I have no doubt in my mind she will be a Wimbledon champion. She might be a Wimbledon champion next year. We could be sitting here and doing the retrospective and feel very comfortable about the way that she moves and performs on that surface. I think there was a lot of factors at play at the Wimbledon championships this year, not due to the fact that you have the banning of Russians and Belarusians. It wasn't a normal tournament. You have the ranking freeze. You have all the things that go on there, and this streak, which is just not, it was a weight, I think. And she spoke about it being a relief and just going on holiday after that. And, just the final point, Elise Cornet played really fucking well. Like, apologies to swear, but like she just played really damn well.
Well, here's the thing that happens, Bush, that Iga goes into a bit of a slump. She loses at the Poland Open, but everyone she ends up losing to is playing out of their skull. Like Caroline Garcia beats her in Poland, in Warsaw. Caroline Garcia had an exceptional year. She was fantastic. Beatrice Haddad-Maia beats her in Toronto. Beatrice Haddad-Maia had an exceptional year, and she had an incredible match herself there. I was there for Tomljanovic and Haddad-Maia, Bush, and Iga played ridiculously well against Tomljanovic, but it was a bit lost because Beatrice Haddad-Maia just had an exceptional week in Toronto. So the questions about slumping and adversity return, because in Cincinnati she loses early again to Madison Keys, kind of setting up pretty good stakes if you're in the Iga camp in terms of expectations, because I know it sounds weird to say for someone coming off a 37 match winning streak and a French Open title, but I don't know what your vibe was heading into the US Open, but she didn't seem like the surefire person to beat to me.
I want to go back and check to see what my own reaction was of whether or not she was going to win the US Open. I feel like I was still pretty adamant that she was going to perform at that level and be able to come back and dominate the way that she had done. And I think that question of burnout, really, if you feel like someone has peaked for the season at the French Open in the way that she has done and all the streak that went together, and then she loses 3, admittedly not early rounds. Like obviously she does not play great in the 3 losses, but all 3 losses are against players who just have absolutely exceptional years, like really, really great years. I don't know. It's kind of fascinating to look back now, is it not, to figure out how much of a surprise was her win at the US Open? Was it really that shocking given the form and just given everything that happened during the season? Or do we look at it now and think, wow, like maybe she was tired and managed to pull it all together? And that is kind of surprising.
I don't know about you, but I have the memory of a goldfish when it comes to sports these days now, especially what happened this year in tennis. So I can't recall off the top of my head. I will say, though, for the haters out there, which they are many, the New York run is one of those ones where you look at the people she beat, you look at some of the scores, you look at the matches themselves. How can you not sit there and be like, holy cow, this woman is just superb. Like, what a run.
It was a fun tournament, wasn't it? Are we fans now of the US Open? I love how I'm also dragging you into
fully
this.
turned. You fully turned. Like I always think I thought I was less harsh on it than you have been in the past, but this year I saw a real Yankee Doodle Dandy turn from Simon Bushell, which is shocking to me as you have now gone farther west and seek refuge in Europe.
That hard court is basically a clay court anyway, so we shouldn't really be that surprised, should we?
Which I think people were telling us we were dead wrong about as well, which I laughed at because they were probably right. It ended up being a bit faster, right?
Mm-hmm. Just a little bit. Can we rename that court and not a hard court, but a sandpaper court? That's probably more accurate.
I like it. I like it a lot.
She beats her good friend and someone who also had an amazing season in Ons Jabeur in the final. I think Jabeur is an interesting person to chat about here because she's a great foil for Iga as well, because apparently very good friends. They both have very good heads on their shoulders, and I think both speak very well. And the fact that they end the season 1 and 2, and the fact that they play the final major and Jabeur goes back to major finals, I think as we started this episode asking the question of what tennis looks like moving on, the fact that you have two incredibly cool people in the way that we do at the top of the game, I think we have to be ecstatic about that.
Big time. And if Iga Swiatek is the main story, and we're talking about Ash Barty's retirement is the second story, and maybe this is strictly on the court stuff because we're not even mentioning Serena Williams, but Ons Jabeur's season as well deserves probably its own episode as well in terms of what she was able to accomplish and the match wins that she was able to string together. But after Iga dispatched Sabalenka in that semifinal, and after she looked quite poor in that first set, I did truly believe that Ons had a good shot in that final, Bush. I really did believe.
Well, it didn't happen, did it?
It did not. It did not.
It wasn't really close. And I think Ons Jabeur is still going to be a Grand Slam champion. The problem is she's going to have to get through Iga Swiatek to do that, and she's not really looked very close to doing that at all so far. And her record is not great either. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens through the course of 2023, or whether that rivalry can become a bit more balanced. That being said, she's the first Polish woman to win the US Open, and it brings her total majors to 3. And we're a long way from the back end of 2021 going into 2022 to have a solitary title at Grand Slam level. Now she's a 3-time Slam champion. She's a repeat champion at Roland Garros. She's won on a different surface. The questions that are being asked of her are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And now she's kind of just chasing history as opposed to chasing her own goals, because yes, she'll have her own goals. But in general, when you start getting anything above 1 in the Grand Slam count and you've been to world number 1 and won the titles that she has, you're starting to look up against some very, very high profile players of who you're chasing.
It's a massive tournament. And again, Serena walking away at that tournament and passing the torch to a bunch of players, not just Iga, but Coco Gauff and Leila Fernandez and Emma Raducanu. It was a seismic moment. It was an important moment, but I would have been fine with Ons winning that tournament, surely. But I do love poignancy, and I do love moments that seem to transcend what is just happening on the court. And Iga cementing herself as the vanguard of the women's tour in New York at the place where Serena had just walked away from the game. It mattered. It mattered because the take economy quickly shifted into, is she bold enough for number 1, or is she a big enough star for number 1? Immediately. And I like I said, I think that conversation will continue into next year. This still felt about tennis, and this still felt about someone getting into their bag and just being straight up better than everyone else and refining that form that she had for so long in the season and responding to, at the time, felt like 3 pretty seismic losses as well to Garcia, Haddad Maia, and Keys. I think I said seismic 400 times on this show, Bush, but it's deserved. It's deserved.
Well, we can analyze while all the conversation around her is bullshit in part 3 as we transition there. And yes, it's about tennis. So let's examine some more of the tennis as we come back, as we round up the illustrious and amazing season that was Iga Swiatek's 2022. Welcome back to the Open Era podcast. We are examining the incredible season that was Iga Swiatek's 2022. Devang, as we left off, she had just won her 3rd Grand Slam, a 2nd of the season, beating Ons Jabeur in the final of the US Open. And I feel like she had silenced many, many of the questions that were surrounding her. And I guess really the questions that were left for us from a narrative standpoint is what the rest of her year would look like. How do you sort of go from that position of being so dominant at Grand Slam level and having the streak that she has to seeing out the rest of the season? Because as we all know, back end of tennis seasons can be incredibly weird.
Yeah, and Bush, I think we haven't mentioned it yet, but Iga, I believe, was one of the loudest voices in a positive sense in terms of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and supporting Ukraine and making that a public stance, which I think a lot of her peers chose not to do for their own reasons, but she didn't shy away from the limelight. And I'm not saying that takes the same toll on you as physically playing a ton of matches and winning all these titles, but I would imagine it does mentally for sure, Simon, and that impacts your fatigue and your psyche and how you're getting up every morning. So obviously the on-court exploits are one thing, but I thought it was a heavy year in general for someone who is becoming world number one, seeing her main rival retire, becoming a vocal force in politics, basically. It was a lot.
Yeah, she was part of a few, wasn't she? She was part of that charity event in Krakow, which they raised money after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. She also did the Tennis Plays for Peace exhibition event, which happened. This was around the middle of the season as well. And she had her own sort of moving away from Ukraine, her own advocacy around mental health awareness. I think she had, as we come on to Ostrava being the next tournament in her chronological season, she donated, I think, all of her prize money actually to a non-profit organization around World Mental Health Day as well. So it's not like she wasn't in the spotlight for differing reasons as well. And I think there's a different magnifying glass which gets presented to you when you are world number one. And just, we have chatted before about how much we appreciate her work within the mental health field and her own transparency in that regard. But to have that go alongside what is asked of you as an athlete when you're at the top of the sport with regards to something like geopolitics, I've been always very impressed with the way that she's handled herself.
And the long answer for what you actually asked, Simon, of what do you do after you win all this stuff and have had a massive year, is you lose some matches again, but then you win a bunch. And that's kind of what Iga kept doing. She goes to Ostrava with 3 exclamation marks, wins a couple matches, but falls to Barbara Krejcikova, possibly the match of the season in that final.
Oh, weird match. Really weird. I think I'm still not over it now, even though it was, 3 months ago as we sit here recording, is that I'm still not entirely sure how Barbara Krejcikova won that. It was actually the longest match of Iga Swiatek's career as well. So goes to show just what a random encounter that turned into be. We stand Babs as well and hope to see her back to full form in 2023. That, even though she lost that match, it took her win total for the season over 60. And you're in rarefied air when you get above the 60 mark. Yeah, there's not many players who have been there, Dev.
Remarkable stuff. Losing Ostrava, but then goes to San Diego. The San Diego Open this year was absolutely loaded with talent. I mean, Iga played Coco Gauff in the quarterfinals, just to give you a glimpse into how stacked this field was. But once again, it's Gauff, it's Pegula, it's Zheng. She beats them all, people that she had to beat a few times this year. And then the surprise finalist, Donna Vekic, who, there's a bagel involved there too, Bush, but that tournament was great. And also it felt like the real WTA finals, even though we did eventually have to go to Texas afterwards.
That San Diego Open, there'll be articles written about it for years of how that all-star field came together, because I've written in the notes, it's like the 5th major of the year. In some ways, it actually felt more like a major than Wimbledon this year. Just given who the field was. And the fact that she was so dominant. You mentioned that match she played against Coco Gauff. She annihilated her. Absolutely annihilated. I know it's not a good matchup for Coco, and we'll see how that evolves in the coming years. And she has to improve that record. Obviously, it's not the most cutting of takes to say that she has to improve her record while she keeps getting bageled by her biggest rival. But in general, the fact that Iga Swiatek was able to be as dominant in that San Diego Open and cement her place at the top of the sport, I think what happens at the World Tour Finals is not really too much of a bother to me.
Not at all. I mean, you jokingly call it the 5th major in the notes, but I agree. And the 8th title of the year, the first player since Serena Williams in 2013 to claim that many titles, to win 67 matches, and to achieve the most bagels in one season. That's a pretty hilarious trifecta there. So most titles, most matches won, and most bagels in a season. Holy cow.
I feel like sometimes we have to stop and take stock of just how good an athlete is to be able to bagel someone else within tennis, because all of these players and athletes are incredible. You don't get to the world's top 100, you don't get to the world's top 10, you don't get to the world's top 50, any of these, without being incredibly good at the sport that you've dedicated your entire life to. But then to have a player come along and you win sometimes less than 10 points in a set against, that is so wide of a margin and so stupid to comprehend that it gives some level of demonstration of how good Swiatek was this season. 22 bagels. That is absolutely ridiculous. 22 times she beat players who are incredible professionals, and to basically give them nothing for an hour of tennis is just remarkable.
Big time. And I saw it in Toronto against Tomljanovic, but when she's able to redline and when she's able to reach her final form, so to speak, in a match, and you're not able to put up any sort of resistance or defense, and you kind of let her get into that zone, that's what happens. And I think the most remarkable thing is she was able to replicate that feat so many times, Bush, where when she got into that T1000 Terminator mode, there was nothing to stop her. There really wasn't. And to be able to shift the momentum against her in matches, I think that's why the losses stand out so much, is because it took some Herculean stuff. It took some massive efforts from her peers to wrestle the momentum away from her, because she did such a great job using that to her advantage.
And I think that's an interesting transition for us to ask the question of where she can improve in her game. Obviously, she loses in the semifinals to Sabalenka, as we alluded to earlier at the World Tour Finals, in a match which I think still showed some of the weaknesses, even though we're talking about an exceptional season, is that she still has to improve her serve. She still has to. It's still a weakness for her against the backdrop of just incredible ground strokes and incredible movement. And if you have one thing that you could really circle for her ability to become an all-time great and be even more dominant, if that's possible, it is to improve her first serve, and it is to get a bit more power and a bit more consistency in it, because those things will be there for her. She is still 21 years of age. She is still growing into her body. And I think that is an area that I would circle on the paper and say that I think she has the potential to get a bit more out of.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think I mentioned this last week on the show about her coach talking about what her season was like, and basically the process that they go through to figure out what their goals are and what their plan of attack is heading into the season. I thought that was a fascinating insight. Like, this is all, I don't want to say like planned, but I think I find some of the quotes, like this one, for example, was it hard to convince Iga to play aggressively? I was lucky that when we worked on it in December, it brought results quickly. She showed she was already a great player, but she just needed a bit of redirection, different training. To be honest, I didn't expect her to be able to put these little things on the court so quickly. She has a forehand swing correction, position on her return was corrected, the ratio of the direction of her shot was corrected. All these things came in rather quickly, and it was easier to build trust, and we were able to move forward based on that. Those are three pretty massive things to implement into your game into the December before the season starts, Bush. But that's what they did. So I feel like they will go into some secret lab in Warsaw and do the same thing.
I love how it's like this idea that you're so good and so talented as a professional and as a tennis player that someone gives you three actually very challenging things to do that might take a person several seasons or maybe an entire career to improve upon. And she does it in a fucking month. Yeah, it's all good, right? Like, how hard could it be to improve these things in these areas? And then goes away and just absolutely nails it. It is testament to her talent of how good she is. So
I mentioned last year off the top, and she leaves Guadalajara in tears and a bit devastated, overcooked from the season. She loses against Sabalenka, someone she had pummeled pretty considerably this season. She loses, but it's like, yep, I'm done. Like, mentally, I'm spent. Physically, I'm spent. I'm okay with this. Peace out. I'll be back. See you in a few weeks. The change, like, it makes sense based on the results that I think her mind is a lot clearer, but I thought it was just a fascinating juxtaposition between the ending of both tournaments.
I'm going to read to you the WTA top 10 as we end, so the year-end ranking list, and ask you a question afterwards. So obviously, Swiatek ended at 1, Jabeur 2, Pegula 3, Caroline Garcia at 4, Sabalenka at 5, Sakkari 6, Goff 7, Katsakina 8, Kudermetova at 9, and then an unnamed Romanian player at 10, who is not currently active. The question I would have for you, Dev, is which of those matchups do you see having the potential for them flipping the balance? Because I look at these and think, I favor Swiatek in every single one of these matchups. I don't see any of these players consistently troubling her, other than maybe the Caroline Garcia matchup, which has proved to be a little bit challenging for her through the course of the year. But Other than that, these are 9 other players that her record is exceptionally good against.
Yeah. She's 5-0 against Coco Gauff, I believe.
Mm-hmm. And bageled her 3 times.
3-0 on hard courts as well. The sample size isn't super large either, which I think is also very interesting, and it makes sense. I mean, a lot of these people are quite young and haven't played each other a ton. So we're going to learn about more about these matches. I mean, Elena Ostapenko's unbeaten against Iga Swiatek. Is that correct? I believe it is.
I think that is correct. Yeah, I believe that is correct.
And so is Ash Barty.
Mm.
Just to throw that conversation back into the mix when Ash returns next season. I did want to touch on, Simon, I think the role Iga now finds herself in as a spokeswoman for sport, and especially in Poland, where she's obviously a big deal. And I think her coming out and making a statement in light of some recent abuses that took place at the hands of people in the Polish Tennis Federation, and speaking out in a forceful way to show support for people that she grew up with, frankly, that suffered a fate because they weren't as lucky as her to have the support system that she had. And she mentioned that in her statement, which I thought was super powerful as well.
I think we keep going back to saying that she has a really good head on her shoulders, and you can tell that she comes from a really solid family background. I think there's just also some class elements to this as well, which she just gets it, right? Like, she understands what it means to be in a position of less power, or to come from, and I think this is probably true of Poland as a state as well, which is, it's not a rich country, although it is still developed and has a ton of positive things about it in the direction that it's going in, but it has been under the boot of some other global powers throughout its history. And I think that mindset, it does kind of take you forward and give you an understanding of what is wrong and right in the world. I'm skirting close to the edge on that one because I can see how that would go in the opposite direction. But I think having an understanding of class is certainly important. And I think also having an understanding of power as well, of who has power and who doesn't. And she just seems to get that, which is remarkable for someone who's still 21 years of age.
I think this quote, personally, I was lucky to not experience such difficult, terrible situations, and I'm grateful for my dad and for how wisely he managed my career. I have an amazing team, safety, and currently I'm really privileged, but I am aware that not every athlete could have the same independence. I hope that with exposure of such matters and solving them carefully and fairly, sports will change for the better in Poland and in the world.
Deb, this athlete is 21. Like, to be able to speak that way is remarkable. And I know there's going to be PR close by and everything, but that doesn't seem like a PR statement. That seems like someone who actually would say that. It seems very genuine to me.
And this is the president of the Polish Tennis Association she's talking about in this post. And like she's transcended that. And I think she's well beyond that level. But I think it still means a hell of a lot to the people within that system that this person who is the one, our champion, that she has our back as well. It means a lot. And I think that's what she's kind of shown throughout the whole year, whether it's about her fellow players, helping them out when they're in jams regarding gear, which happened in Australia, I believe, when there was some flight problems. And I can't recall the name of the player that she did help out off the top of my head, but stories like that, stories about how her peers themselves speak so highly of her, representing her country and representing her tour so well. Like, we're fortunate, man. We're really fortunate. And I do want to say again, before we get to the, why isn't she a bigger star, or why isn't her face on billboards in New York and Paris and all that crap, really cherish the fact that this person is in this game and decided to play tennis and decided to spend her time doing this, because we're really, really fortunate for that.
Well, it's not all good, remember, because she occasionally waves her arms at the net when someone is trying to hit a passing shot against her. So, like, she's clearly not perfect here.
You gave that argument the right voice, by the way. That dopey,
yes,
I'm a clown voice. That was deserved.
She's just got to be better than this, right? Unbelievable. Like, to see. Anyway, let's move on from that. I will ask you a question. Is Iga Swiatek deserving of the Best Athlete in the World award for 2022?
Oh,
can you name me an athlete who had a better season across the board? Because I can't think of any.
Oh, man. This is tough to just spring on me like this without me doing any sort of any sort of homework. Was there an Olympics this year? I think there was. Not that kind of clouds everything. I want to say yes. I think definitely top 5. Definitely top 5 sport-wide. She had the streak. She had the slams. She had the off-the-court impact. She checked all the boxes. She revolutionized the game this season, Bush. Mm-hmm. And I think that deserves its flowers.
We stand our sport at any possible opportunity to say this, but like with the greatest respect against everything else, she did this week in, week out for 11 straight fucking months. To have to turn up in every single country in every single part of the world on different surfaces in the hottest of temperatures. There is no other sport that can really have to argue to do that. And she did that and demolished her opponents at every opportunity that she could do. I don't think there's a man or a woman in the world who was more dominant in their respective fields this season.
I feel really lucky I was able to see her live a couple of times during this season, Bush. Because as much as I talked about seeing Fed in like 2014, 2015 and saying how that was a monumental moment for me. And I didn't get to see that much live tennis back then. It's still a pretty rare occurrence for me to see these people live and in person. And just getting a glimpse into seeing that forehand, that machine gun forehand live and in person. I'm thankful for that this year. Very thankful.
Let's close with a number, which I think probably cements how good of a season this was, 11,000. And that is the number of ranking points she accrued this season. She obviously ended the year as world number 1. Those 11,000 ranking points, 11,000 plus ranking points, was the most since Serena Williams in 2013. So again, you're in rarefied air. It was a phenomenal tennis season. It was a phenomenal season for her off the court as well. And if it sounds like we are giving too much glowing praise, I think we're just extremely lucky to piggyback off what you were saying, to see a season like this and to have a person at the top of the sport in the way that we do, because it's not often that you get the amalgamation of both of these things against the backdrop of some pretty horrendous and pretty shitty stuff that's happened in sport and the world in 2022.
Well said, sir. Let's leave it there. As always, thank you so much for listening to the show. If you enjoyed it, a rating or review wherever you get this podcast would be wonderful for us as we wrap up 2022. We're also on patreon.com/open era. Join us there. Get the show early on Sundays. Get it ad-free. Plus, join us on the Discord where we're chatting tennis all the time, including what's coming up in 2023. Because the Aussie Open in Australia is only a few weeks away, which sounds crazy to say, but yeah, that's true. And also, one final reminder, Twitter as well, @OpenEraPod. Still tweeting there. We'll probably get into it a bit more, obviously, in January. But some news regarding January and what we're doing probably coming soon as well, Bush. As you figure that stuff out, December, baby. Decisions. Anything else before we go, Simon, before I close out?
No. Let's say no.
Good. For producer Greg on the ones and twos, welcome back, Greg. We miss you dearly. And for Simon, thank you for listening to Open Era. We'll talk to you next week.